Catherine Hart, one of Boston's most celebrated concert pianists, stopped in her tracks at Park Street Station on a bitter November evening, drawn by the sound of Mozart's Concerto No. 21, rising from a battered Casio keyboard, played with such aching purity that tears blurred her vision before she even saw the performer. She never imagined the 13-year-old girl sitting on that cold concrete floor, wrapped in a threadbare coat too thin for the season, fingers red and trembling as they danced across chipped keys for a few scattered coins, would shatter everything she thought she knew about genius, legacy, and the very meaning of music itself. She had no way of knowing that this homeless child carried in her veins the blood of the greatest composer who ever lived. Before I continue the story, please subscribe. I need to reach 1,000 subscribers so I can keep bringing you stories like this every day. It's just one click for you, but it means a lot to me. Thank you. Emma Clark sat cross-legged on the grimy concrete floor of Park Street Station, her 13-year-old frame looking smaller than it should beneath a coat that had seen better years, its gray wool frayed at the cuffs and missing 2 buttons that she had long ago stopped hoping to replace. The November cold seeped through the thin fabric, through her worn jeans, through everything, settling into her bones with a kind of chill that never quite left. Not even when she slept. Her fingers, exposed by fingerless gloves she had knitted herself from donated yarn, were red and stiff, but still they moved across the yellowed keys of her Casio keyboard with a grace that seemed to come from somewhere beyond the physical world. Before her sat a plastic coffee cup, her tip jar, containing $3.47, the sum total of 2 hours of playing to an endless river of commuters who flowed past her like water around a stone. Their eyes fixed on their phones, their ears stuffed with AirPods, their hearts carefully guarded against the sight of yet another homeless person trying to survive another day. She did not blame them. The city taught you to look away, to keep moving, to protect yourself from the crushing weight of all that suffering you could not possibly fix. But Emma played anyway, because the music was not for them. Not really. The music was her prayer, her offering, her way of holding on to something beautiful in a world that had taken almost everything else. The old keyboard, salvaged from a church donation bin 3 years ago, was missing the G above middle C, forcing her to improvise around the gap, to find new pathways through melodies she heard in her head with perfect clarity. The sound it produced was tinny, mechanical, nothing like the rich warmth of a real piano. And yet somehow, through sheer force of feeling, through the intensity of her focus and the purity of her intention, Emma coaxed from those cheap plastic keys something that stopped the rare passerby in their tracks, something that made them pause and wonder where such music could possibly be coming from in this cold, indifferent place. Emma had woken that morning in the narrow cot she shared with her mother at the Pine Street shelter. Sarah's labored breathing the first sound she heard, the way it had been every morning for the past 2 years. Her mother lay curled on her side, her once vibrant auburn hair now streaked with premature gray, her 41-year-old body worn down by the lupus that had stolen everything from them piece by piece, year by year, bill by bill. Emma had helped her mother sit up slowly, carefully, supporting her weight as Sarah's joints protested the movement, as they always did in the cold morning hours before the medications kicked in. They had a routine now, born of necessity and repetition. Emma would retrieve their allotted breakfast from the shelter kitchen, help Sarah dress, lay out the 7 different medications that kept her mother's immune system from destroying itself, medications that cost more each month than most people paid in rent. She remembered when they had a home, a small 2-bedroom apartment in Dorchester, where her mother had taught piano lessons in their living room, where the sound of scales and sonatas had filled their days with purpose and beauty. That was before the diagnosis, before the medical bills began arriving like an avalanche, before her mother could no longer work, before the insurance company found reasons to deny their claims, before the savings account drained to nothing, before the eviction notice, before the bankruptcy, before the shelter. Emma had been 11 years old when they lost everything. Old enough to understand they were drowning, but too young to do anything, except watch her mother try to shield her from the worst of it, watch her mother's spirit crumble under the weight of failing her only child. That was when Emma had found the keyboard, when she had taught herself to play from the worn music books her mother had managed to save, when she had discovered that she could take the melodies living in her head and translate them into something real, something people might pay for. Every dollar she earned went into the envelope her mother kept hidden in their shared locker. The envelope marked first month's rent in Sarah's shaking handwriting, a dream that seemed to recede further with each passing month. Emma would do anything for her mother, carry any burden, play until her fingers bled if that was what it took. Sarah had given up everything trying to keep them together. Now it was Emma's turn to fight. Emma's days had fallen into a rhythm as predictable as a metronome. She attended William McKinley Middle School until 3 o'clock, her backpack heavy with textbooks she studied in the shelter's common room each night, determined not to let homelessness steal her education the way it had stolen everything else. By 4:15, she was in her spot at Park Street Station, the corner near the Red Line platform where the acoustics were best, where the sound carried up through the tunnels and caught the ears of commuters making their transfers. She played until 8, sometimes 9, when Officer Martinez would gently tell her it was time to pack up, that the shelter doors locked at 10, and she needed to get moving. Her repertoire consisted mostly of Mozart, though she could not explain why his music called to her with such urgency, why his melodies felt less like something she had learned, and more like something she was remembering from a dream she could not quite grasp. She played his Piano Concerto, number 21, until the missing G forced her to improvise, played his Sonata number 16 in C major, played the Rondo alla Turca, even though it made her cheap keyboard sound more like a toy than an instrument. Something about Mozart's music felt like home, like a language she had always known, but never spoken aloud until now. There were small mercies in her routine, tiny kindnesses that kept her faith in humanity from completely extinguishing. Mr. Chen, who worked at the financial firm downtown, dropped a $5 bill in her cup every Tuesday and Thursday without fail, never stopping to chat, never making a show of his generosity. The woman with the red scarf, whose name Emma did not know, sometimes brought her hot chocolate from the Dunkin' Donuts upstairs, setting it beside her without a word. Just a sad smile that said, "I see you, I'm sorry, I wish I could do more." And then there was Hector, the station manager, a heavy-set man in his 50s, who by all rights should have chased her away for busking without a permit, but instead pretended not to notice her, occasionally wandering past to drop a handful of quarters in her cup while muttering something about keeping the noise down. At night, when sleep would not come, Emma let herself dream of a real piano, a grand piano with ivory keys and a sound so rich it could fill a concert hall, her fingers flying across the keys without the gaps, without the compromises, playing Mozart the way he was meant to be heard. Catherine Hart lived in a brownstone on Beacon Hill that featured in architectural magazines, attended galas where champagne flowed like water and conversations sparkled with wit but contained no real substance, and performed to sold-out crowds at Symphony Hall, who applauded her technical perfection while never suspecting that she felt nothing, absolutely nothing, when her fingers touched the keys anymore. She was 52 years old and had achieved everything a classical pianist could dream of achieving. 3 Grammy nominations, performances with every major orchestra in North America, a teaching position at the New England Conservatory that came with prestige, and a salary that made her accountant smile. Her life looked perfect from the outside, a gleaming surface that reflected success and sophistication. But inside she was hollow, scraped clean of purpose by a grief that refused to fade even after 2 years. Her protégée, Isabelle Chen, had been more than a student. The girl had been the daughter Catherine never had. The reason she still believed in the transformative power of music, the living proof that beauty and meaning could exist in this world. Isabelle had been 19, brilliant, on the cusp of her own magnificent career, when a drunk driver ran a red light on Commonwealth Avenue and extinguished everything in an instant. Catherine had not really played since then, not in any way that mattered. She went through the motions, fulfilled her contracts, maintained her reputation, but the music had become just sound, mathematical patterns her fingers executed without her heart's participation. She had decided, finally, that it was time to stop pretending. Tonight she was meeting with the board of the conservatory to announce her retirement, to release her students to teachers who might actually have something left to give them, to step away from the stage before anyone noticed she was already gone. She descended into Park Street Station with the weight of this decision pressing on her chest, thinking about how she would phrase it, how she would explain that music had lost its meaning when the person who understood it best was no longer alive to hear it. The subway platform was crowded with the evening rush, bodies pressed together in that uniquely urban solitude where you can be surrounded by hundreds of people and still feel completely alone. She was halfway to the red line when she heard it. A sound so pure and unexpected that it stopped her mid-stride as surely as if someone had called her name. Catherine was thinking about Isabel's hands, the way they had moved across the piano keys with such confidence, such joy. When the sound reached her through the crowd noise and the rumble of arriving trains, through the protective shell she had built around her heart. Mozart's Piano Concerto, number 21. The second movement, the andante that everyone knew from the film but few truly understood, rising from somewhere ahead of her with a simplicity that made her breath catch in her throat. The melody was wrong in places, simplified, with odd gaps where notes should have been, played on what sounded like a toy keyboard that could barely reproduce the complexity of Mozart's vision, and yet something about it pierced straight through the numbness that had insulated her from feeling anything real for 2 years. Catherine stopped walking, causing the businessman behind her to grunt in irritation as he swerved around her. But she did not care, could not move, could only stand there as the music washed over her like a wave she had forgotten how to ride. She followed the sound, pushing through the crowd, until she saw the girl, 13, maybe 14, sitting on the cold floor with a keyboard across her lap, her thin frame wrapped in a coat that offered no real protection against the November chill. The child's eyes were closed, her face tilted slightly upward as though she were listening to something beyond the music she was creating, and her fingers, red and exposed in fingerless gloves, moved across the keys with an unconscious grace that defied her complete lack of formal training. Catherine could see the technical flaws immediately. The way the girl had never learned proper hand position, the tension in her shoulders that would cause pain after extended playing. But none of that mattered because what she was hearing was not technique. What she was hearing was truth. The girl played Mozart the way Isabel had played, with a purity of interpretation that came from someplace deeper than education or practice. From that mysterious source where music lived before it became sound. There was no showmanship in her playing, no attempt to impress or manipulate the listener's emotions. She simply opened herself and let the music pour through, unfiltered by ego or artifice, or the thousand small corruptions that crept into even the most accomplished performer's art. Catherine felt tears on her cheeks before she realized she was crying, felt something crack open in her chest that had been frozen solid since the day they lowered Isabel's casket into the ground. For the first time in 2 years, she felt the music again. Catherine moved closer, positioning herself where she could watch the girl's hands without blocking the flow of commuters. And what she saw confirmed what her ears had already told her. This child was untrained, self-taught, working entirely by instinct and feeling. Her left hand barely moved, providing only the most basic harmonic foundation, while her right carried the melody with a tenderness that seemed impossible from fingers so young and cold. The girl's wrists were too high, her thumb tucked under instead of extended, her posture all wrong according to every pedagogical principle Catherine had spent 30 years teaching. And yet somehow those red, trembling fingers found their way to exactly the right keys at exactly the right moment, as though the music itself was guiding them home. There was no sheet music, Catherine noticed. No reference point except whatever the girl heard in her own head, and when she missed the notes that clearly did not exist on her cheap keyboard, she improvised around them with a musicality that spoke of deep, intuitive understanding rather than formal training. Catherine reached into her purse, past the leather wallet that held her credit cards and identification, and pulled out $100 bill, one of several she kept for tipping at the upscale restaurants where the conservatory held its donor dinners. She waited until the girl finished the piece, until the final notes faded into the ambient noise of the station, and then she leaned forward and placed the bill in the plastic cup, with its pitiful collection of coins and singles. Emma's eyes flew open, wide with shock, darting from the money to Catherine's face with an expression that was equal parts gratitude and suspicion. "Who taught you to play like that?" Catherine asked, her voice hoarse with emotion she had not expected to feel. The girl's face closed like a door, protective instincts honed by life on the streets. "YouTube videos. Mostly," she said quietly, her fingers still resting on the keys as though ready to resume playing if this conversation became uncomfortable. Catherine shook her head. "No, I mean, who taught you to feel the music that way? To interpret Mozart with such understanding?" Emma looked down at her keyboard, at her raw fingers, at the $100 bill that represented more than she usually made in a week. When she looked up again, her eyes held something ancient, something that should not have existed in a 13-year-old homeless girl sitting on a subway platform. "No one," she said simply. "I just feel the music. It's always been there. Like it's part of me. I don't know how else to explain it." Catherine did not sleep that night. She lay in her king-sized bed in her climate-controlled bedroom, staring at the ceiling while Mozart's Concerto No. 21 played on an endless loop in her mind, not as she had performed it 1,000 times in concert halls around the world, but as that girl had played it on a broken keyboard in a subway station, with all its technical imperfections and all its devastating emotional truth. She had gone to her meeting with the conservatory board, sat through their concerns about enrollment numbers and fundraising goals. And when the moment came to announce her retirement, she had heard herself say instead that she needed another semester to consider her options. Watching their relieved faces and wondering what had possessed her to delay the inevitable. But she knew. That girl. That impossible, heartbreaking, miraculous girl. Catherine returned to Park Street Station the next afternoon, arriving at 4:30. Telling herself she was being ridiculous, that she had probably imagined the whole thing, that grief and exhaustion had caused her to hear something that was not really there. But when she descended the stairs and heard the music rising up to meet her, she knew she had imagined nothing. Emma was there in her same spot, wearing the same threadbare coat, her fingers flying across the same cheap keyboard, this time playing something Catherine did not immediately recognize, something that sounded like an improvisation on a Mozart theme. The girl taking the composer's melodic ideas and spinning them into new patterns as naturally as breathing. Catherine positioned herself behind a pillar where she could observe without being seen, where she could watch the stream of commuters flow past this child like she was invisible, dropping coins or nothing at all into her cup. She watched for nearly an hour, noting the way Emma's thin shoulders hunched against the cold, the way she flexed her fingers between pieces to restore circulation, the way she counted the money in her cup during brief breaks with an expression of quiet desperation that spoke of bills that needed paying, of responsibilities too heavy for a 13-year-old to carry. This was not a hobby, Catherine realized. This was survival. And yet the music never suffered, no matter how cold, how tired, how hungry the girl might be. When her fingers touched those keys, something transcendent emerged, something that could not be taught or learned but only given, a gift so rare that Catherine had encountered it perhaps 3 times in her entire career. She needed to know more. She needed to understand who this child was, where she had come from, how someone so young and untrained could possess such profound musical instinct. She needed to help, if help was what the girl would accept. Catherine waited until Emma finished a piece, waited until the girl was counting the meager contents of her cup before she stepped forward and cleared her throat. Emma looked up, recognition flickering across her face. Then, wariness. "I don't want your pity," the girl said quietly, her chin lifting with a dignity that broke Catherine's heart. "I'm not asking for charity. I work for what I earn." Catherine nodded, respecting that fierce pride even as she ached at the necessity of it. "I'm not offering charity," she said carefully. "I'm offering lessons, free piano lessons, on a real instrument. I'm a teacher at the New England Conservatory, and you have a gift that shouldn't be wasted on a keyboard missing keys." Emma's eyes narrowed, suspicion hardening her young face into something older, more cynical. "Nothing's free," she said flatly. "I've learned that. What do you want from me?" The question was so direct, so loaded with the painful wisdom of someone who had been taken advantage of before, that Catherine had to take a moment to gather herself. "I had a student," she said finally, her voice thick with the grief she rarely allowed herself to voice. "Her name was Isabel. She was 19, and she played the way you play, with that same pure feeling. She died 2 years ago, and I haven't been able to hear music the same way since, until yesterday, until I heard you." Emma's expression softened slightly, the wariness not disappearing but making room for something else, some recognition of shared pain. "I'm sorry," she said quietly, "but I still don't understand what you want." Catherine smiled sadly. "I want to teach again. I want to remember why music matters, and I think maybe you need someone to teach you before bad habits become permanent." Emma was silent for a long moment, her fingers absently tracing patterns on the keyboard. "I can't stop playing here," she said finally. "I need the money. My mom is sick, and we need every dollar I can make." Catherine nodded immediately. "I'm not asking you to stop. Come to my studio on weekends, just a few hours. Learn proper technique, learn to read music better. Play on a real piano. The rest of your time is yours." Emma studied Catherine's face, searching for the trap, the hidden cost, the inevitable disappointment. Whatever she saw there must have satisfied her, because she nodded slowly. "Okay," she whispered. "Okay, I'll try it." Catherine felt something unlock in her chest, something that had been closed since the day they buried Isabel. Emma stood on the steps of the Beacon Hill brownstone that following Saturday morning, her entire body rigid with the certainty that she did not belong in this world of brass door knockers and flower boxes that cost more than her mother's monthly medications. Catherine opened the door herself, dressed casually in jeans and a sweater that probably cost more than everything Emma owned, and gestured her inside with a warmth that did nothing to ease the knot of anxiety in Emma's stomach. The interior was like something from a magazine, all hardwood floors and oriental rugs and artwork on walls painted in soft, expensive colors. But Emma barely registered any of it because there, in the front parlor, bathed in light from tall windows, sat a Steinway grand piano so beautiful it made her throat tighten. The instrument gleamed like a living thing, its black lacquer finish reflecting the room, its keyboard a perfect expanse of ivory and ebony keys that had never known a missing note or a broken mechanism. Catherine watched Emma's face with understanding. "Go ahead," she said softly. "Touch it." Emma approached as though the piano might vanish if she moved too quickly, reached out with trembling fingers, and pressed a single key. The sound that emerged was so pure, so rich and full and alive, that tears sprang to her eyes. This was what music was supposed to sound like. This was what she had been hearing in her head all along. Catherine began with basics, testing Emma's sight-reading skills with a simple Mozart minuet, and quickly discovered what she had suspected. The girl could barely read music at all, stumbling over basic notation like a first-year student. But when Catherine played a complex passage from memory and asked Emma to repeat it, the girl reproduced it perfectly after hearing it just once, her ear translating sound to movement without conscious thought. "Play something for me," Catherine said finally. "Anything you want. Just play." Emma settled onto the bench, adjusted her posture the way she had seen pianists do in YouTube videos, and began Mozart's Concerto, Number 21. The same piece Catherine had first heard her play, but this time without the missing notes, without the tinny mechanical sound, without any barrier between the music in her soul and its expression in the world. The transformation was staggering. Catherine sank into a nearby chair, her hand pressed to her mouth, tears streaming down her face as this 13-year-old homeless girl filled her home with something so beautiful, so pure, so achingly perfect that it felt like a visitation from the divine. The lessons became a ritual, every Saturday and Sunday morning. 3 hours that Emma guarded as fiercely as she guarded the envelope of rent money at the shelter. Catherine taught her properly now, drilling her on scales and arpeggios, forcing her to slow down and learn the technical foundations she had skipped in her self-education, correcting her hand position and posture with gentle but insistent guidance. Emma absorbed it all with a hunger that reminded Catherine why she had become a teacher in the first place. The girl's mind soaking up knowledge the way parched earth drinks rain. Between exercises, they talked, and slowly, carefully, Catherine learned the story of Emma's life. Sarah Clark had been a piano teacher once, Catherine discovered, working from their small apartment in Dorchester, teaching neighborhood children their scales and simple songs. She was good, Emma said quietly, her fingers still moving through a Hanon exercise. Really good. She played beautifully. I remember falling asleep to her music when I was little. Then, the lupus diagnosis had come, and with it, the slow unraveling of everything. Catherine asked about Emma's father during their fourth lesson, as gently as she could, and watched the girl's face close. Never knew him, Emma said flatly. He left before I was born. My mom doesn't talk about him. Catherine nodded, not pushing, but filing away the information. She asked about family history, about grandparents, about roots, trying to understand where this extraordinary musical gift had come from. Emma shrugged, her knowledge shallow and uncertain. Mom's parents died when she was young. She was raised by an aunt in New Hampshire. I never met them. She paused in her playing, thinking. I know my mom's maiden name was Wolf, Sarah Wolf. She said it was German. That her family came over in the 1800s sometime. But that's all she ever told me. She doesn't like talking about the past much. Catherine felt something stir in the back of her mind, some half-formed connection she could not quite grasp. Wolf, a German name, a family with musical talent spanning generations. Sarah, who had played beautifully, and Emma, who played like someone channeling the divine. Does your mother still play? Catherine asked. Emma shook her head, sadness darkening her eyes. Her hands hurt too much now. The lupus attacked her joints. She hasn't touched a piano in 3 years. Catherine spent her evenings at her laptop, searching genealogical databases and historical records, following the thread of the name Wolf through immigration documents and census records and the fragmentary digital archives of European musical history. The name appeared again and again in connection with music, scattered through Austria and Germany in the 18th and 19th centuries. Teachers and performers and composers of minor renown, a family whose lifeblood seemed to run with melody. She found a Maria Wolf who had married into the Mozart family line in 1823, a connection so distant it should have been meaningless, but Catherine's instincts were screaming that nothing about Emma was meaningless. The girls' progress in their lessons defied every pedagogical expectation Catherine had developed over 3 decades of teaching. Emma absorbed technique and theory with frightening speed, her fingers adapting to proper form, while somehow retaining that ineffable quality that made her playing transcendent. By their 8th lesson, she was sight-reading intermediate pieces with only minor stumbles. By their 12th, she was tackling advanced Mozart sonatas with an interpretive maturity that left Catherine breathless. This was not normal learning. This was awakening. Catherine called her friend Marcus Webb on a cold December evening, inviting him to her studio the following weekend, under the pretense of wanting his opinion on a promising student. Marcus was a musicologist at Harvard, a specialist in musical genealogy who had written definitive texts on the family trees of great composers, tracing talent through bloodlines like a detective following evidence. He arrived Saturday morning with his characteristic enthusiasm, his wire-rimmed glasses and unruly gray hair, giving him the appearance of an absent-minded professor straight from central casting. Catherine had Emma play for him, choosing Mozart's Sonata No. 11, and watched Marcus's face transform from polite interest to genuine astonishment as the girl's fingers brought the music to life. When Emma finished, Catherine sent her for a break with money for hot chocolate from the cafe down the street, then turned to Marcus with barely contained intensity. Her mother's maiden name was Wolf, she said without preamble. German ancestry, immigrated in the 1800s. The girl plays Mozart like she's remembering it rather than learning it. Marcus, I think there's something ancestral here. I think her gift isn't just talent. I think it's legacy. Marcus leaned forward, his eyes gleaming with the fervor of a scholar scenting a mystery worth solving. Tell me everything you know, he said. Sarah collapsed at the shelter 3 weeks before Christmas, her fever spiking to 104 degrees, her immune system turning against itself with a ferocity that sent her straight to Massachusetts General Hospital, in an ambulance Emma could not afford. The doctors used words like flare-up and hospitalization and specialized treatment, words that translated into bills Emma could not begin to comprehend. Numbers with so many zeros they seemed like a cruel joke. Sarah needed to stay for observation, needed new medications, needed care that insurance covered only partially, leaving a balance that grew larger every day like some malignant thing feeding on their desperation. The shelter informed Emma they could not hold Sarah's bed indefinitely, that if she was hospitalized for more than 2 weeks, they would have to give her spot to someone else, which meant Emma would lose her spot too, which meant they would be on the street when Sarah was finally released. Emma stopped coming to lessons, stopped answering Catherine's calls and texts, and threw herself into playing at the subway station with a manic intensity that frightened the regular commuters who had grown accustomed to her presence. She played from 3 in the afternoon until Officer Martinez forced her to leave at 10. Played through hunger and cold and exhaustion, played until her fingers bled and then wrapped them in tape and played some more. The money was never enough. It was never, ever enough. Catherine found her on a Thursday evening, collapsed beside her keyboard in Park Street Station, her face gray with exhaustion, her body trembling with fever she had ignored for 3 days because she could not afford to stop working. Catherine knelt beside her, pressed her hand to Emma's burning forehead, and felt fury and heartbreak war inside her chest. "Why didn't you call me?" she demanded, but Emma just shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "I can handle it," she whispered. "I have to handle it." Catherine made a decision in that moment, the kind of decision that changes everything, that commits you to a course you cannot reverse. She called an Uber, loaded Emma and her keyboard into the car, drove to Massachusetts General to collect a bewildered and protesting Sarah, and brought them both to her brownstone on Beacon Hill. "You're staying here," she said firmly, brooking no argument. "Both of you. In my guest suite. Until we figure this out. And Emma, you're done killing yourself in that subway station. Do you understand me? You're done." The guest suite on Catherine's 3rd floor had its own bathroom, its own sitting area. 2 bedrooms that seemed impossibly spacious after years of shelter, cots, and cramped quarters. Sarah sat on the edge of the bed that first night, her thin frame wrapped in one of Catherine's robes, her eyes red from crying and exhaustion, and the overwhelming disorientation of finding herself in this beautiful place. "This is too much," she whispered to Catherine, her voice breaking. "We can't impose on you like this. You don't even know us." Catherine sat beside her, took her hand with a gentleness that made Sarah cry harder. "You're not imposing," she said firmly, "and I know enough. I know your daughter has a gift that comes once in a generation. I know you raised her to be kind and strong despite circumstances that would have broken most people. That's enough." Sarah wanted to protest further, wanted to maintain some shred of dignity, but her body was failing and her spirit was depleted, and the relief of not having to fight for one single night was so overwhelming she could only nod and let this stranger show her a kindness she had forgotten existed in the world. Catherine used her connections, her wealth, her reputation to open doors that had been firmly closed to a homeless woman with inadequate insurance. She arranged for Sarah to see a lupus specialist at Brigham and Women's Hospital, one of the best in the country, who adjusted her medications and developed a treatment plan that actually addressed her condition rather than just managing its worst symptoms. She hired a nurse to check on Sarah twice a week, arranged for physical therapy to help with the joint pain, simply handled the details of survival that had consumed every moment of Emma's existence for 2 years. Marcus, meanwhile, had become obsessed with the Wolf genealogy, spending his days in archives and his evenings on international databases, following threads through Austrian parish records and immigration manifests. He called Catherine almost daily with updates, his excitement growing as the picture became clearer. As the connections multiplied, as what had seemed impossible began to look like truth, and Emma, for the first time in her memory, could simply play. She woke each morning and went to the Steinway, practiced for hours without worrying about tips or time limits or whether her mother had taken her medications. Her playing deepened, her technique solidified, and the gift that had always been there began to flourish without the weight of survival crushing it into something desperate and small. Marcus arrived at Catherine's brownstone on a January morning with a leather portfolio under his arm and an expression of barely contained triumph on his face. He spread documents across Catherine's dining room table like a detective laying out evidence. Photocopies of parish records and marriage certificates, and immigration manifests, a paper trail spanning 2 centuries and an ocean. "The wolf line traces back to Vienna," he began, his finger moving across a family tree he had painstakingly reconstructed. Sarah's great-great-great-grandfather was Johann Wolf, who immigrated to America in 1872 from Austria. Before that, the family lived in Vienna for 3 generations. He pulled out another document, a marriage record from 1849. Johann's mother was Anna Mozart Wolf. Born Anna Mozart in 1823 in Salzburg, she married Heinrich Wolf, a merchant, and the family moved to Vienna. Catherine's breath caught. "Mozart? She was born Anna Mozart?" Marcus nodded, his hands trembling slightly as he reached for the oldest document. A baptismal record from Salzburg so faded, Catherine could barely read the script. Anna Mozart was the illegitimate daughter of Franz Xaver Wolfgang Mozart, Wolfgang Amadeus, Mozart's younger son. Franz Xaver never married, but he had a relationship with a woman named Josefa Baroni Cavalcabo, an Italian soprano. Their daughter Anna was acknowledged but carried her father's name rather than her mother's. Catherine felt the room tilt slightly, the implications cascading through her mind, like dominoes falling. Franz Xaver Wolfgang Mozart had been a composer and pianist himself, taught by his father's contemporaries, carrying the Mozart legacy into the 19th century. And if Anna had been his daughter, then the bloodline continued, unbroken, through Heinrich Wolf, through their descendants who eventually immigrated to America, through generations who likely never knew the significance of their heritage. Through Sarah, who played beautifully until illness stole her ability, through Emma, who sat upstairs at this very moment, playing Mozart as though channeling the composer himself. "Are you certain?" Catherine whispered. Marcus pulled out DNA analysis from distant Mozart relatives whose bloodlines were already established, comparative studies he had commissioned through academic channels. "As certain as genealogical research can ever be. The paper trail is clear. Emma Clark is Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart's last living direct descendant. The only one." Marcus arranged for DNA testing through the University of Vienna, which maintained samples from established Mozart family descendants, distant cousins several times removed, whose lineage had been verified through decades of genealogical research. Sarah agreed to the testing with bewildered consent, still weak from her recent hospitalization, not fully understanding why it mattered but trusting Catherine's judgment. Emma provided her sample with the casual indifference of a teenager who could not imagine why anyone cared about her ancestry when there were more immediate concerns like her mother's health and their uncertain future. The results took 6 weeks to process, 6 weeks during which Catherine tried to prepare herself for what confirmation would mean while simultaneously trying not to hope too hard in case the paper trail had been wrong, in case there had been a break in the line somewhere, a misattributed birth, or an unknown adoption. The email arrived on a Tuesday afternoon, and Catherine read it 3 times before her hands stopped shaking enough to call Marcus. The match was positive. 99.7% probability of direct descent through the paternal line traced back through Franz Xaver Wolfgang Mozart to Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart himself. Emma Clark, 13 years old, homeless until 3 weeks ago, playing for tips in a subway station, was the last living carrier of Mozart's direct bloodline. The only one. Every other branch had died out. Ended. But this one fragile thread had persisted through 2 centuries of wars and migrations and ordinary human survival until it culminated in a girl who played his music as though remembering it from some genetic memory encoded in her very cells. Catherine sat in her study. Marcus's documentation spread before her, and wept at the staggering improbability of it all, at the cruel beauty of a homeless child carrying such a legacy in her blood while sleeping in a shelter, at the miracle of their meeting, at the responsibility now resting on her shoulders. She had to tell Emma, had to tell Sarah, had to help them understand what this meant. But how did you explain to a 13-year-old girl that she was not just talented but historically significant, not just gifted but the living embodiment of musical genius that had changed the world? How did you give someone that knowledge without crushing them under its weight? Catherine gathered them in her living room on a Saturday evening, the Steinway gleaming in the lamplight like a silent witness. She had rehearsed this conversation a dozen times, but every version felt inadequate to the magnitude of what she needed to say. Sarah sat on the sofa. Emma curled beside her, both women watching Catherine with expressions of concern as she paced before them with Marcus's portfolio clutched in her hands. "I need to tell you something," Catherine began, her voice unsteady. "Something Marcus discovered about your family history, about who you are." She spread the documents on the coffee table, the family tree with its careful notations, the marriage records and baptismal certificates, and DNA analysis. Emma leaned forward, frowning at the names and dates that meant nothing to her yet, while Sarah's hand went to her throat. Some instinct already sensing the earthquake coming, Catherine told them everything, starting with Johann Wolf and working backward through the generations until she reached the name that changed everything. "Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart," she said quietly. "Emma, you are his direct descendant, his great-great-great-great-great-granddaughter, the only living person who carries his bloodline." Emma stared at her, mouth open, the words so impossible she could not process them. "That's crazy," she whispered. "That can't be real." But Sarah had started crying, her hands pressed to her face, her body shaking with sobs that seemed torn from someplace deep and ancient. "I always wondered," she gasped. "I always felt it. This connection to music that went beyond just loving it. Like it was in my bones, in my blood. When I played, it felt like remembering instead of learning. I thought I was being romantic, making up stories to explain why I couldn't imagine a life without music. But it was real. It was real all along." Emma looked at her mother, then at Catherine, then at the documents spread before her. Understanding dawned slowly, like sunrise breaking over a dark landscape, illuminating everything she had never been able to explain. Why Mozart's music called to her with such urgency, why playing felt less like skill and more like channeling something that already existed inside her. Why she could hear the notes before her fingers found them, why improvisation felt as natural as breathing. "Oh," she said softly, and then again. As tears began streaming down her face, Catherine made calls to every contact she had cultivated over 3 decades in Boston's classical music world. And within 2 weeks, she had secured Symphony Hall for a special benefit concert in late March, the proceeds going to support homeless youth programs, a cause no one could refuse. She announced only that she would be presenting a promising young student, keeping Emma's identity deliberately vague. But someone at the conservatory had loose lips, and within days the story broke. The Boston Globe ran it first, a front-page article with the headline, "Mozart's Last Descendant Found Playing for Tips in Subway Station." And then the feeding frenzy began. CNN, NPR, The New York Times, BBC. Media outlets from around the world descended on Boston wanting interviews, photographs, verification of the impossible story about the homeless 13-year-old girl who carried the great composer's blood. Catherine shielded Emma and Sarah as much as possible, releasing a carefully worded statement through the conservatory's press office. But the attention was overwhelming, transformative, terrifying in its intensity. Emma's hands shook when she sat at the piano now, not from cold or hunger but from the crushing weight of expectation, from the knowledge that people would come to Symphony Hall not to hear her play, but to witness a genetic curiosity, a historical footnote made flesh. She broke down crying 3 days before the concert, convinced she would fail, convinced she was a fraud who happened to have the right ancestors, but none of the real genius required to honor their legacy. Catherine held her, let her cry, and then sat beside her at the Steinway, with a firmness born of decades of preparing students for high-stakes performances. "Listen to me," she said, taking Emma's face in her hands. "You are not Mozart. You don't have to be. His music has survived 234 years because it speaks truth that transcends time and genetics. Your gift is not that you share his blood. Your gift is that you can feel what he felt when he wrote those notes, that you can translate emotion into sound with honesty and purity. Play for the music, Emma. Not for the name, not for the people watching, not for history. Just play because the music needs to be heard. The way you've always played. Symphony Hall was sold out, every seat filled with people who had come to witness history. To see if the impossible story could possibly be true, to judge whether this child deserved the mantle that genetics had placed upon her shoulders. Emma stood backstage in a black velvet dress Catherine had bought for the occasion. Her hands ice cold despite the warmth of the concert hall, her heart hammering so violently she thought it might break through her ribs. Sarah sat in the front row, wrapped in a shawl despite her weakness, her face radiant with pride and terror in equal measure. Catherine walked onto the stage to introduce her student, and the audience fell silent. "Genius is not inherited," Catherine said, her voice carrying to the furthest balcony seats. "Talent can run in families, but the spark that transforms technical skill into transcendence cannot be passed down through DNA. What you will hear tonight is not Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart reborn. What you will hear is a young woman who found music in the darkest circumstances, who played for survival and discovered something greater than survival, who reminds us that beauty and truth can emerge from places we have trained ourselves not to see." She turned toward the wings, extending her hand. "Emma Clark." Emma walked onto that stage, past the first violins and the conductor's podium, to the Steinway that waited in the spotlight like an old friend. She sat, adjusted the bench, placed her hands on the keys, and for one terrible moment she could not remember how to begin. Then she heard Catherine's voice in her memory. Play for the music. She began Mozart's Piano Concerto No. 20 in D minor, and the moment her fingers touched the keys, the fear evaporated. This was what she knew. This was what she was. The orchestra swelled behind her, and Emma let the music carry her away from the watching crowd, away from expectations and genetics and history, into that place where only the notes mattered, where Mozart's genius met her soul and created something neither could have achieved alone. When the final chord faded, there was a beat of perfect silence. And then the audience rose as one, applause thundering through the hall, tears streaming down faces in every row. Sarah was sobbing openly, and Catherine stood in the wings with her hand pressed to her heart, watching a homeless girl transform into something the world would never forget. The scholarship offers arrived by the dozen, prestigious conservatories from around the world, competing for the privilege of shaping Mozart's descendant into the next great concert pianist. Juilliard, Curtis, the Royal Academy in London, the Paris Conservatoire, each with their promises of full tuition, living expenses, and opportunities that would have been unthinkable 3 months ago when Emma had been sleeping in a shelter and playing for coins. Catherine spread them across her dining room table. Let Emma and Sarah read through each one, understanding that the choice was not hers to make, even though her heart ached at the thought of losing this girl who had become so precious to her. Emma studied the offers carefully, her young face serious with the weight of decision, and then she looked at Catherine with eyes that held more wisdom than any 13-year-old should possess. "I want to stay here," she said quietly. "I want to study with you, if you'll still teach me." Catherine's eyes filled with tears as she nodded, unable to speak past the gratitude choking her throat. Sarah's medical treatments were now fully funded by an anonymous donor consortium that Catherine had quietly assembled from her wealthy contacts, people moved by the story and willing to ensure that this family would never face medical bankruptcy again. Sarah began to improve under consistent, high-quality care. Her medications properly managed, her strength slowly returning. She began teaching piano again, working with underprivileged children through a program at the conservatory, passing on the gift that had sustained her through the darkest times. Catherine drew up guardianship papers, making official what had already become true in their hearts, creating a family bound not by blood, but by music and mutual rescue. She had saved Emma, but Emma had saved her too, had given her a reason to feel music again, to believe that beauty and meaning could survive loss and grief. Emma enrolled at Boston Latin School, practiced 4 hours a day under Catherine's guidance, and began preparing for a professional career that stretched before her like an open road. But twice a month, she returned to Park Street Station with her old Casio keyboard, sat in her corner near the Red Line platform, and played for the commuters rushing past. Some recognized her now, stopped to listen. But many did not. And that was exactly how Emma wanted it. She never wanted to forget where she came from, never wanted to lose touch with the girl who had played for survival and discovered that music was the one thing poverty could not steal. 5 years passed, like a symphony building to its crescendo, each movement more beautiful than the last. Emma turned 18 and performed with the Boston Symphony Orchestra. Her name on concert programs from Vienna to Tokyo, her playing praised not for her ancestry, but for the profound emotional truth she brought to every note. Sarah's health stabilized, her strength restored enough that she now worked as a music therapist at Massachusetts General Hospital, bringing the healing power of music to patients fighting the same battles she had once fought alone. Catherine and Emma were mother and daughter in every way that mattered. Bound by shared grief transformed into shared purpose, by music that had saved them both when they needed saving most. Together they established the Mozart Legacy Foundation, dedicated to finding and nurturing musical talent in the places society had trained itself not to look, providing instruments and lessons and scholarships to homeless youth who carried genius in their souls but nothing in their pockets. On a cold November evening, 18-year-old Emma walked through Park Street Station on her way to Symphony Hall and heard music rising from the platform below. She stopped, descended the stairs, and saw a boy no more than 12 sitting with a battered violin, playing Bach with raw, untrained brilliance, while commuters flowed past him like water around a stone. Emma stood there listening, tears streaming down her face. And in that moment she understood that this was the real legacy. Not the blood running through her veins, but the choice to stop, to listen, to see the invisible people carrying impossible beauty. She approached the boy, placed a $100 bill in his cup, and said the words that would change his life, the way Catherine's words had changed hers. Perhaps you have walked past genius today and never knew it. Perhaps you have dismissed someone's potential because their circumstances blinded you to their gifts. The next time you see someone struggling, someone society has forgotten, someone playing music in a subway station or creating art on a street corner or carrying dreams too big for their situation, stop and look closer. Kindness costs nothing, but it can change everything. Legacy is not just what we inherit, but what we choose to pass on. Subscribe to see more stories that remind us of our shared humanity, that challenge us to look beyond the surface, that prove beauty and genius can emerge from the most unexpected places. Because the greatest masterpiece is not a piece of music, but a life transformed by someone who cared enough to listen.